August 23, 1853. Bayou Lafourche, Louisiana. A sugar plantation foreman named Declan Royce woke before dawn to count his enslaved workers as he did every morning. He stood at the edge of the slave quarters with a lantern in one hand and a leather-bound ledger in the other. He counted once, then counted again, then a third time. 27 people were missing. Not one, not two, not a handful who might have slipped into the swamp under cover of darkness. 27. Gone. No footprints leading away from the quarters, no broken fences, no disturbance in the dirt. The dogs picked up no scent. The night patrol had seen nothing. The gates had not been opened. It was as though 27 human beings had simply dissolved into the earth. Royce sent riders in every direction. He posted notices in 3 parishes. He offered a combined reward of $6,000. Nothing. No sightings, no captures, no word from any slave catcher between Lafourche and the Texas border. For 3 weeks, the disappearance consumed the parish. Plantation owners whispered nervously at church. Overseers doubled their patrols. The local newspaper ran the headline, "27 vanish from Bellefleur Plantation. No trace found." Then, on September 14th, a field hand clearing brush near the tree line stumbled into a hole. Not a natural hole. A tunnel. 3 feet wide, 4 feet tall, reinforced with stolen timber and packed clay. It ran for 312 yards beneath the sugar fields, beneath the fence line, beneath the road, and opened into a drainage ditch that fed into the bayou. When the foreman crawled inside, he found something that made him sit down in the mud and stare. Spoons. Hundreds of them. Tin spoons, wooden spoons, spoons bent and broken from years of scraping through clay and root and stone, piled against the tunnel walls like the bones of small animals. 27 enslaved people had dug a tunnel longer than 3 football fields, using nothing but spoons. It had taken them 4 years, and no one had heard a single sound. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss the stories history tried to hide. The plantation was called Bellefleur, beautiful flower. The name had been chosen in 1811 by its original owner, a French-born sugar merchant named Gaston Marchand, who believed that beautiful names made ugly things more acceptable. Bellefleur sat on 1,200 acres of rich Louisiana bottomland along the Bayou Lafourche, 60 miles southwest of New Orleans. The soil was dark and heavy, ideal for sugarcane, which grew tall and thick in the humid air. By the 1840s, Bellefleur was one of the most profitable sugar plantations in Lafourche Parish. It produced over 400 hogsheads of sugar per year and employed, if that word can be used for forced labor, 138 enslaved men, women, and children. They lived in 2 rows of wooden cabins behind the main house. The cabins had dirt floors, no windows, and roofs that leaked when it rained, which, in Louisiana, was often. The main house, by contrast, was a white-columned mansion with 14 rooms, crystal chandeliers imported from France, and a wraparound porch where the owner's family drank lemonade in the evenings while watching the sunset over fields that had been planted, tended, and harvested entirely by human beings they owned. In 1844, Gaston Marchand died of yellow fever. The plantation passed to his son, Pierre Marchand. Pierre was 31 years old. He had been educated in New Orleans. He spoke French and English. He played the piano. He attended Mass every Sunday. And he was the cruelest man most of the enslaved people at Bellefleur had ever known. Not because he was loud or violent in the way some overseers were violent. Pierre Marchand was quiet, methodical. He kept detailed records of punishments, He assigned a numerical value to every infraction: 5 lashes for slow work, 10 for talking, 20 for looking him in the eye. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The whip spoke for him. Under Pierre's management, Bellefleur became a place where silence was survival. Enslaved people learned to move without sound, to work without pause, to endure without expression. And beneath that silence, something was growing. His name was Moses. Not the name given to him by the Marchand family. They called him Samuel. But among the enslaved community at Bellefleur, he was Moses. The name carried weight. Everyone understood why. Moses was 43 years old in 1849, the year everything began. He had been born on a cotton plantation in Alabama and sold to Bellefleur at age 19. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with hands that could bend iron and a mind that never stopped working. He was the plantation blacksmith. This position gave him something most enslaved people did not have: access. He moved between the forge, the stables, the sugar mill, and the tool shed. He repaired equipment. He shoed horses. He built gates and hinges and locks. He understood metal. He understood wood. He understood how things were put together, and he understood how they could be taken apart. Moses had tried to escape once before, in 1841. He had run north toward Baton Rouge with 2 other men. They were caught after 4 days by a patrol with dogs. The other 2 men were sold south to Texas. Moses was whipped so severely he could not stand for 2 weeks. Pierre Marchand had watched the whipping from his porch, sipping coffee. Afterward, he told Moses calmly, "Run again, and I will sell your wife and children to separate buyers in 3 different states. You will never see any of them again." Moses had a wife named Celia and 3 children: a daughter, Nettie, age 12, a son, Thomas, age 9, and a baby girl, Pearl, who was 2. He did not run again. But he did not stop thinking. For 8 years, he watched. He studied the landscape. He memorized the patrol schedules. He noted where the soil was soft and where it was hard. He observed the water table during rainy seasons. He calculated distances. And in the spring of 1849, while repairing a drainage pipe near the north fence, he discovered something that changed everything. The soil beneath the sugar fields was not solid clay all the way down. 18 inches below the surface, there was a layer of soft alluvial sediment, loose enough to scrape with a hand tool, firm enough to hold a tunnel ceiling if properly braced. And 300 yards to the northeast, past the property line, past the road, a drainage ditch ran into Bayou Lafourche. If a tunnel could reach that ditch, a person could crawl out, enter the bayou, and disappear into a water system that stretched for miles in every direction. No footprints, no scent for dogs to follow, no trace. That night, lying on the dirt floor of this cabin, Moses stared at the ceiling and began to plan. The first tool was a tin spoon. Moses took it from the cookhouse. It was bent, dull, and missing half its handle. It had been used to stir soup for years and was destined to be thrown away. He hid it inside the lining of his boot. That night, after the patrol passed his cabin at midnight, he crawled beneath the floor through a gap between the foundation stones and began to dig. The space beneath the cabin was narrow, perhaps 2 feet between the ground and the floorboards, enough room to lie on his stomach and scrape at the earth with the spoon. The soil was softer than he expected. The alluvial layer gave way easily, crumbling into loose clumps that he could push aside with his forearms. In 2 hours, he had carved a space the size of a washtub. He covered it with loose dirt, crawled back into the cabin, and slept for 3 hours before the morning bell. The next night, he dug again, and the night after that. For 3 weeks, he worked alone, silent, patient, moving dirt by handfuls, spreading it beneath the cabin floor where it would not be noticed. By the end of the first month, he had carved a passage 6 feet long, angled slightly downward, heading northeast toward the tree line. He told no one. Trust was dangerous. One wrong word, one careless whisper, one frightened person breaking under the pressure of a whipping. That was all it would take. But Moses could not dig 300 yards alone, not in his lifetime. He needed help. He chose the first man carefully. His name was Elijah, 51 years old, a field hand who had been at Bellfleur longer than anyone. Elijah had lost his wife to a sail in 1838 and his only son to fever in 1842. He had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. Moses told him on a Sunday afternoon while they sat behind the smokehouse where conversations could not be overheard. Elijah listened without speaking. When Moses finished, Elijah looked at him for a long moment. "How long?" he asked. "Years," Moses said. "And if we get caught, we die?" Elijah nodded slowly. "I've been dying since they took my boy," he said. "Might as well die going somewhere." Elijah brought in the next 2, a young man named Daniel, 24, fast and strong, and his brother Amos, 22, quieter but sharp-minded, who worked in the sugar mill and understood engineering in the instinctive way that enslaved people who maintained complex machinery often did. Over the next 6 months, the group grew, slowly, carefully, one person at a time. Every new member was chosen for specific reasons. Celia, Moses' wife, because she could sew canvas bags to carry dirt. Thomas, his 9-year-old son, because he was small enough to fit into spaces adults could not reach. A woman named Patience, who worked in the main house kitchen because she had access to spoons, knives, and information about the master's schedule. An old man named Solomon, 73, who had been a carpenter before arthritis bent his hands. He could no longer swing a hammer, but he could design bracing structures for the tunnel ceiling from memory. By the end of 1850, 27 people knew about the tunnel, 14 men, 8 women, 5 children. They called it the church because going beneath the ground at night felt like worship, and because if anyone overheard them whispering about going to church, no one would think twice. The system they developed was extraordinary in its simplicity. Every night after the midnight patrol passed, teams of 3 entered the tunnel through the gap beneath Moses' cabin. They worked in 2-hour shifts. One person dug, one person packed the ceiling with clay and timber, one person carried dirt backward in small canvas sacks sewn by Celia. The dirt was distributed across multiple locations, some beneath cabin floors, some mixed into the garden soil behind the quarters, some carried in pockets during the day and scattered in the sugar fields while working. The tunnel advanced approximately 8 inches per night. 8 inches. In a good week, they gained 4 feet. In a bad week, when rain softened the soil too much or patrols increased, they gained nothing. Solomon designed the bracing system. Every 3 feet, a frame of stolen timber was wedged against the walls and ceiling. The timber came from the plantation itself, fence posts that were reported as rotted, barn planks that were said to have been burned, scraps from the sugar mill that were listed as waste. Pierre Marchand kept meticulous records of his property, but he never counted his scrap wood. The spoons were the primary digging tools. Tin spoons from the cookhouse, wooden spoons carved from branches, Occasionally, a stolen chisel or a bent nail that could be used to loosen compacted clay. Over 4 years, they wore through an estimated 240 spoons. The broken ones were left in the tunnel walls, pressed into the clay like fossils. Air was the most dangerous problem. As the tunnel grew longer, the oxygen at the far end diminished. Diggers would become dizzy, lightheaded. Sometimes they would lose consciousness and have to be dragged backward by their ankles. Amos solved this. He fashioned a ventilation system from hollow reeds stolen from the bayou's edge during work details. The reeds were connected end to end and pushed up through the soil at intervals, creating narrow air shafts disguised as natural plant growth on the surface. From above, they looked like weeds. From below, they were the difference between life and death. Declan Royce was Pierre Marchand's head overseer. He was Irish, 40 years old. He had come to Louisiana as a young man with nothing and had built his position through a willingness to do things other men would not. Royce was not stupid. He noticed small things. A spoon missing here, a worker who seemed unusually tired in the morning, dirt under someone's fingernails that did not match the color of the field soil. In the fall of 1851, 2 years into the digging, Royce began watching Moses more carefully. He could not explain why. There was nothing specific. Moses performed his duties as blacksmith without complaint. He met his quotas. He kept his eyes down. But Royce had survived in Louisiana by trusting his instincts, and his instincts told him something was wrong. One evening, Royce walked through the slave quarters after dark, which he rarely did. He moved slowly between the cabins, listening. He heard nothing unusual, but when he passed Moses's cabin, he noticed the faintest smell. Fresh earth, the kind of smell that comes from recently turned soil. He paused. Then he moved on. The next morning he told Pierre Marchand about his suspicion. Pierre listened, then shrugged. "You think they are digging a garden?" he said with a thin smile. "I think something is happening in those quarters that I cannot yet identify," Royce replied. "Then identify it," Pierre said. "That is what I pay you for." Royce began conducting random inspections of the cabins. He would arrive without warning, order the occupants outside, and search the interior. He searched Moses's cabin twice. Both times the entrance to the tunnel was covered by a heavy wooden chest that Celia had positioned over the gap in the foundation stones. The chest was filled with cooking pots and appeared to have been in place for years. Royce found nothing. But he did not stop watching. The closest they came to being caught was on a night in March of 1852. Daniel was digging at the tunnel face, now 160 yards from the cabin, when his spoon struck something hard. A rock. Limestone. Embedded in the clay like a fist. He could not go around it. The tunnel was too narrow. He could not go over it without risking the ceiling. He had to go through it. He scratched at it for an hour. The noise was louder than anything they had produced before, a grinding, scraping sound that seemed to travel through the earth. Above him, on the surface, a night patrol guard named Jennings stopped walking. He stood directly over the tunnel, though he did not know it. He listened. The sound came again, faint, rhythmic, like something scratching beneath the ground. Jennings knelt and pressed his ear to the earth. Below, Daniel had stopped digging. He lay absolutely still, his face pressed into the clay, his breath held. 30 seconds passed. A minute. Jennings stood up. He looked around the dark field. He saw nothing. The sound had stopped. He attributed it to an animal, a mole, perhaps, or an armadillo. He walked on. Below the ground, Daniel did not move for another 20 minutes. When he finally resumed digging, his hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the spoon. The limestone took 11 nights to get through. 11 nights of silent, terrified scraping. When it finally broke apart, Daniel found that the soil beyond it was softer than anything they had encountered. Rich, wet, easy to move. They were entering the floodplain near the bayou. The end was coming closer. The information that kept them alive came from inside the main house. Patience worked in Pierre Marchand's kitchen. She cooked his meals, she served his guests, she cleaned his study, and she listened. Enslaved people who worked inside plantation houses occupied a peculiar position. They were treated as invisible. Masters spoke freely in front of them, because they did not consider the people serving them capable of understanding. This was perhaps the greatest miscalculation slaveholders ever made. Patience heard everything. She knew when Pierre was expecting visitors. She knew when slave catchers were in the parish. She knew when patrols would be increased. She delivered this information in code. When she hung laundry on the line, the arrangement of the clothing carried meaning. A red cloth on the left meant patrols were heavy. A white cloth in the center meant the road was clear. 2 cloths knotted together meant danger. Stop all work immediately. In the summer of 1852, Patience learned something critical. Pierre Marchand was planning to sell 11 enslaved people in the fall to cover debts. The names had not been finalized, but Patience had seen a preliminary list. 3 of the 27 were on it, including Celia and Nettie. When Moses learned this, he went behind the forge and stood with his hands pressed against the anvil until his breathing steadied. If Celia and Nettie were sold before the tunnel was complete, everything they had worked for would be meaningless. He calculated. The tunnel was 208 yards long. They needed approximately 100 more yards. At 8 inches per night, that was approximately 450 nights, over a year. They did not have a year. Moses called the 27 together on a Sunday afternoon. "We work double shifts," he said. 2 teams every night instead of 1. 4 hours instead of 2. "The risk doubles," Elijah said quietly. "The risk of staying is worse," Moses replied. No one argued. From that night forward, the tunnel advanced 16 inches per night instead of 8. The workers grew thinner. Dark circles formed under their eyes. Their hands bled from the constant scraping. During the day, they moved through their labor like ghosts, something closer to fury. In April of 1853, the rains came. Louisiana spring rains were not gentle. They fell in sheets, turning fields into swamps. The Bayou Lafourche rose 6 feet in a single week, and water began seeping into the tunnel. At first it was a trickle, a dampness in the walls, puddles forming along the floor. Then, on the night of April 19th, a section of the tunnel 60 yards from the entrance collapsed. Amos was inside when it happened. The ceiling gave way with a sound like a muffled thunderclap. Clay and timber crashed down, filling a 10-foot section with debris. Amos was buried up to his chest. For 45 minutes, Daniel dug with his bare hands, clawing mud away from his brother's body while the walls groaned around them. When Amos finally came free, his left leg was broken below the knee. They carried him backward through the tunnel, inch by inch. Amos could not walk for 6 weeks. But the real damage was to the tunnel. The collapsed section would take weeks to clear and rebuild. Weeks they did not have. Moses sat in the dark beneath his cabin and stared at the blocked passage. 4 years of work, 270 yards completed, 42 yards remaining. And now a wall of mud between them and freedom. He picked up a spoon, and he began to dig. The collapsed section took 23 days to clear, 23 days of hauling wet clay in canvas sacks. Solomon, the old carpenter, redesigned the bracing for the remaining section. "Water pushes down," he said. "You must push back harder." By mid-May, they had cleared the collapse. Every inch was fought for. Moses stopped sleeping. His body was breaking. His hands, once strong enough to bend iron, trembled constantly. He coughed blood into his sleeve and told no one. Celia saw it. She said nothing. On August 14th, 1853, Daniel's spoon broke through into open air. He was lying on his stomach, scraping methodically when the clay suddenly gave way and his hand pushed through into empty space. Cool air rushed in. Night air. The smell of water and grass and something impossibly sweet. Freedom. He pressed his face to the opening and breathed. Then he carefully widened the hole until he could see outside. The drainage ditch, running with slow, dark water. They had done it. 312 yards, 4 years, 27 people. Spoons. Daniel crawled backward faster than he had ever moved and emerged into Moses's cabin covered in mud. "It's through," he whispered. Moses closed his eyes. "When?" Celia said quietly. 9 days, Moses said. The new moon. The 9 days that followed were the most dangerous. 27 people had to prepare to leave without alerting anyone. Food had to be gathered, stolen carefully, hidden in the tunnel. The children had to be prepared. Pearl, now 6, was told they were going on a journey. She was told she must not speak, must not cry, must not make any sound until her mother said it was safe. She nodded solemnly. She had been raised in slavery. She already understood silence. Moses gave instructions to each member individually. You enter the tunnel, one at a time. 2 minutes between each person. You do not stop. If the tunnel collapses, the people behind the collapse continue to the exit. The people in front of the collapse go back. What if I am in front of the collapse? Young Thomas asked. Moses looked at his son. Then you keep digging, Moses said. The hardest part was leaving people behind. 111 enslaved people at Belflor did not know about the tunnel. They could not be told. The risk was too great. Moses carried this weight in silence. On the night of August 21st, Elijah sat beside Moses. You know, some of us won't make it, Elijah said. Solomon can barely walk. Amos's leg isn't healed right, and the children. Everyone goes, Moses said. Everyone goes. Or it meant nothing. August 23rd, 1853. No moon. The sky was black and heavy with clouds that blocked even the stars. At midnight, the patrol passed Moses's cabin. 2 men with lanterns, walking slowly, talking about a card game. Their footsteps faded. Moses waited 10 minutes. Then he lifted the chest. Celia went first. She carried Pearl on her back. She lowered herself through the gap and entered the tunnel. The darkness inside was absolute. She began to crawl. Behind her, 2 minutes later, Thomas entered. Then Nettie, then Daniel. Then Amos, dragging his damaged leg behind him, biting down on a strip of leather to keep from crying out. One by one, the 27 entered the earth. Elijah was second to last. Moses was last. He pulled the chest back over the opening from inside, and he began to crawl. The tunnel was completely dark. Moses moved by touch alone, his fingers reading the walls he had built over 4 years. He could hear breathing ahead of him, the soft shuffling of bodies moving forward, and beneath all of it, the sound of 27 hearts beating in the dark. The journey through the tunnel took over 2 hours. Solomon, the old carpenter, was the slowest. Every few yards he stopped, pressed his forehead into the clay, and breathed until the pain became manageable. Behind him, Daniel waited in silence. He did not push. At approximately 2:15 in the morning, Celia reached the exit. She pushed through the opening and fell into the drainage ditch. She stood up and breathed. Louisiana air, bayou air, the smell of cypress and mud and open water. One by one, the others emerged, muddy, exhausted, trembling. Some cried silently. Some simply stood in the water and looked at the sky as though they had never seen it before. When Moses finally pulled himself from the tunnel, he was the last one out. He stood in the ditch and counted heads in the darkness. 27. All present. He looked back at the tunnel opening, a dark hole in the bank. 4 years of his life, 240 broken spoons, the finest piece of engineering in Lafourche Parish, and no one would ever know who built it. "Move," he said quietly. They entered the bayou. Bayou Lafourche connected to a network of waterways that could carry them south toward the Gulf of Mexico, then west toward Mexico, where slavery had been abolished since 1829. The 27 moved in single file through water that ranged from ankle-deep to chest-deep. They moved only at night. During the day, they hid in the dense cypress groves covered with Spanish moss, invisible from more than 10 feet away. On the second night, they heard dogs in the distance, the baying of hounds following a scent. Moses stopped the group. They stood motionless in the water, listening. The dogs grew louder, then began to fade. The hounds had reached the bayou and lost the trail. On the 4th day, they reached a settlement of free black fishermen. On the 5th night, the 27 put to sea. They sailed west along the Gulf Coast, navigating by the stars. The North Star was behind them now. They followed the western horizon. After 11 days, they reached the mouth of the Rio Grande, Mexico. Moses stepped onto the southern bank of the river on September 8, 1853. He fell to his knees. From the weight of something he had carried for 4 years finally lifting from his shoulders, Moses gave instructions to each member individually. "You enter the tunnel, one at a time. 2 minutes between each person. You do not stop. If the tunnel collapses, the people behind the collapse continue to the exit. The people in front of the collapse go back." "What if I am in front of the collapse?" young Thomas asked. Moses looked at his son. "Then you keep digging," Moses said. The hardest part was leaving people behind. 111 enslaved people at Bellflour did not know about the tunnel. They could not be told. The risk was too great. Moses carried this weight in silence. On the night of August 21st, Elijah sat beside Moses. "You know, some of us won't make it," Elijah said. "Solomon can barely walk. Amos's leg isn't healed right, and the children." "Everyone goes," Moses said. "Everyone goes." Or it meant nothing. August 23rd, 1853. No moon. The sky was black and heavy with clouds that blocked even the stars. At midnight, the patrol passed Moses's cabin. 2 men with lanterns, walking slowly, talking about a card game. Their footsteps faded. Moses waited 10 minutes. Then he lifted the chest. Celia went first. She carried Pearl on her back. She lowered herself through the gap and entered the tunnel. The darkness inside was absolute. She began to crawl. Behind her, 2 minutes later, Thomas entered, then Nettie, then Daniel, then Amos, dragging his damaged leg behind him, biting down on a strip of leather to keep from crying out. One by one, the 27 entered the earth. Elijah was second to last. Moses was last. He pulled the chest back over the opening from inside, and he began to crawl. The tunnel was completely dark. Moses moved by touch alone, his fingers reading the walls he had built over 4 years. He could hear breathing ahead of him, the soft shuffling of bodies moving forward, and beneath all of it, the sound of 27 hearts beating in the dark. The journey through the tunnel took over 2 hours. Solomon, the old carpenter, was the slowest. Every few yards he stopped, pressed his forehead into the clay, and breathed until the pain became manageable. Behind him, Daniel waited in silence. He did not push. At approximately 2:15 in the morning, Celia reached the exit. She pushed through the opening and fell into the drainage ditch. She stood up and breathed. Louisiana air, bayou air, the smell of cypress and mud and open water. One by one, the others emerged, muddy, exhausted, trembling. Some cried silently. Some simply stood in the water and looked at the sky as though they had never seen it before. When Moses finally pulled himself from the tunnel, he was the last one out. He stood in the ditch and counted heads in the darkness. 27. All present. He looked back at the tunnel opening, a dark hole in the bank. 4 years of his life, 240 broken spoons, the finest piece of engineering in Lafourche Parish, and no one would ever know who built it. "Move," he said quietly. They entered the bayou. Bayou Lafourche connected to a network of waterways that could carry them south toward the Gulf of Mexico, then west toward Mexico, where slavery had been abolished since 1829. The 27 moved in single file through water that ranged from ankle-deep to chest-deep. They moved only at night. During the day, they hid in the dense cypress groves covered with Spanish moss, invisible from more than 10 feet away. On the second night, they heard dogs in the distance, the baying of hounds following a scent. Moses stopped the group. They stood motionless in the water, listening. The dogs grew louder, then began to fade. The hounds had reached the bayou and lost the trail. On the 4th day, they reached a settlement of free black fishermen. On the 5th night, the 27 put to sea. They sailed west along the Gulf Coast, navigating by the stars. The North Star was behind them now. They followed the western horizon. After 11 days, they reached the mouth of the Rio Grande, Mexico. Moses stepped onto the southern bank of the river on September 8, 1853. He fell to his knees. From the weight of something he had carried for 4 years finally lifting from his shoulders, Celia stood beside him. Elijah stood in the shallow water and laughed. Solomon, the old carpenter who had designed the bracing, sat on a rock and wept. He was 77 years old. He had been enslaved for 77 years. And now, he was free. When Declan Royce discovered the tunnel, he spent 3 hours inside it. He crawled the entire length. When he emerged, covered in mud, he was silent for a long time. Then he said, "They built this with spoons." Pierre Marchand's reaction was rage. He ordered the tunnel destroyed. But the tunnel was too well built. The timber bracing Solomon had designed held firm even when heavy stones were dropped onto the surface above. It took 3 weeks to destroy what 27 people had built over 4 years. Pierre Marchand sold 14 enslaved people in the weeks that followed, blaming them for not reporting the tunnel. He posted the largest fugitive slave reward in history. No one ever claimed it. The 27 settled in the Mexican state of Coahuila. Moses became a blacksmith again. He never returned to the United States. He died in 1871 in a house he had built with his own hands on land no one could take from him. Celia lived until 1889. Thomas became a teacher. Nettie married a Mexican farmer. Pearl lived until 1921. She was the last survivor. In her final years, she told the story. "My father built a road under the ground," she would say, "with spoons. And he carried 27 people to the other side of the world." Solomon's grave marker reads, "Solomon, builder, free." Elijah's last words were, "I can still hear them digging." Amos kept a carved spoon on a shelf. "In case I ever need to dig again," he said. He never did. Bellefleur Plantation no longer exists. The mansion burned in 1879. The slave quarters were demolished. By the 1920s, the fields had been converted to cattle pasture. In 1974, a construction crew discovered a section of underground passage lined with deteriorating timber and containing fragments of tin and wood. The discovery received little attention. In 2019, a graduate student named Danielle Toussaint published a paper arguing that the tunnel had been real. Her paper included a photograph of one of the fragments, a tin spoon, bent almost in half. It sits now in a display case at the LSU Museum. It does not mention Moses. It does not mention the 27. It does not explain that this small piece of bent metal was part of something extraordinary, that it was held by hands that refused to accept that the world above them was the only world available. But the spoon is there. And now, so is the story. 27 people, 312 yards, 4 years. Spoons. They did not wait to be freed. They freed themselves, 1 inch at a time. Follow this channel for more stories that history tried to bury. If this story touched your heart today, I'd like to invite you to join our community. Please consider subscribing so we can keep these memories alive, together. Bringing these hidden pieces of history to light is a labor of love, but it takes time and deep research. If you feel moved to support this mission, you can buy me a cup of coffee. Your kindness helps me keep digging, keep writing, and keep making sure these voices are never silenced again. Because stories like this don't just appear. They have to be found. And sometimes they're hidden for a reason.